Okay guys, so in the last video we looked at the object browser and we looked in these libraries and we saw all these classes and they have all these members, and each class has all these members, different members. And now you might be wondering, well, how do I know what what objects, what classes I'm going to use and what members of those classes I'm going to use? And there's a very simple answer to that. It's called the macro recorder. The macro recorder is like your own expert VBA programmer that is with you all the time when you're in Excel. And when you use the macro recorder, any action that you perform is translated into VBA code and saved in a module. So it's like you just doing some action, and you have an expert VBA programmer behind you writing VBA code. So let's see how this works. If we go into Excel, first of all, let me just go into Excel. If we go into Excel, let's say that, let me clear this out real quick. Let's say that I have this range here, and I have date, and I have amount, and I have some dates here: 1/1/2013. Oops. And I have some amounts here. Let's say I want to write a macro that will copy this range to a different sheet and then do some formatting of the range. So we can use the macro recorder to do it for us, and then we could take a look at the code. So let's get to the macro recorder. And we get to the macro recorder by going to the developer tab, and then up here this icon says record macro. So if we click this record macro, a window pops up and it says give the macro a name. So let's give it a name like move range, and then it says shortcut key, and this is, you could put a letter in here like control and then E. If you press control E, it'll run this macro. So you can associate something on the keyboard to run this macro, and that's called a shortcut key. And then it says where do you want to store this macro. This workbook is fine. You could put it in a new workbook. The personal macro workbook, I could talk about that later, but it's not important right now. For the time being, you could just store it in this workbook, and then you could put a description like this is my the move range macro or something. And then you click OK, and once you click OK, every action you take is going to be translated into VBA code. So let's click OK. And now notice up here it says stop recording. So right now it's recording our actions. And what we want to do is copy this range. So I'm just going to go here, right click, press copy. I'm going to go to a different sheet. Here's a message box. I should get rid of those. And I'll just paste it on this different sheet. So I'm going to do paste, and I'll do paste special values. And let's also do a couple other things. Let's format the whole column here into a date. So I'll right click on the column, I'll do format cells. I'll change the format of that column, the first column, to dates. And let's do a couple other things. Let's put the sum of these two numbers here. I'll just put actually the sum going down to row 700 in case I have more numbers. So there's the sum. And now let's format this range a little bit. I'll make these bold by clicking Control B, and I'll center the whole worksheet by going up here and clicking on center, and then I will highlight the color here yellow. So now let's say I recorded this macro because I want to do these actions every day, but I don't want to do it manually like I just did now. I want to write a macro to do it. So I could stop the recorder, and I'll just press stop recording, And now the macro is written, and we just have to go and find it. So all those actions we just performed, the macro recorder, it wrote the VBA code, and to see where it wrote the code, we can just go into the editor, click on that icon, and it will create a new module. So down here, it created this module 1. This wasn't there before. After I ran the macro recorder, it put all this code here into this module called module 1. Sometimes if you use the macro recorder more than once to record multiple macros, it'll put it in the same module. But at a certain point, it'll add another module. So if I did this like 10 times, there would be 2 or 3 modules, like module 2, module 3. So we could look in this module that it created, module 1, and here's our macro. Remember, we named it move range, and we put a description, or we put a description here. This is the move range macro, and here's all the code that it recorded. Now this is pretty amazing because we didn't write any of it. We didn't write any of this code, and we are able to just perform the action we want to perform and then see how the VBA code looks. And this is your number one best friend if you want to become a VBA programmer. If you want to know how to do something, just use the macro recorder like we just did and take a look at the code. And it should be not always 100% straightforward, but you'll get an idea of exactly what is going on and how to perform those actions. So if you want to know how to select cells, well, just record a macro that selects cells. If you want to know how to copy something and paste it on a different sheet, just do what we did. So here you can see exactly what we did. We selected this range, and then we copied it here. So here's the range we selected, but we were on the goodbye sheet. So this is where we started. It didn't record what sheet we're on because we were already on that sheet. So we should, if we want to do this action over and over again, here's a bit of code, sheet5.select, that selects a worksheet, so I can just copy that in. And how did I know this was the code to select a worksheet? Well, it's because right after I copied this range, I selected the worksheet, so that has to be the code. So I can just, the first line of code should be sheets goodbye.select. There I select a sheet, then I select those cells. I could step through this and you could see what's happening here. So here, just trying to move this. Let me bring this down here. Okay, so, and let me just, so here we go. This line I added here, but let's step through it and see what happens. Here, I added that line to select a sheet. Now, I selected that range, and this is all done by the macro recorder. It wrote this code. We're just stepping through it now. Then I activated that cell B6. Then I copied this whole range, and you could see there the dancing border. Then I went over to sheet 5, and I selected, well, there's a message box, so we could get rid of that. Notice that the select the worksheet activate event takes priority over your macro, so it's gonna pop up that message box. I could comment that out in a second, but after I selected sheet 5, I selected cell A2, and then here's where I pasted in the values, selection.paste special, and then these are parameters. So this is a parameter, and then the value of the parameter. So this colon equals, it sets the paste parameter to this value. And then there's a comma, and there's another parameter, an operation parameter, and it sets the operation parameter with the colon equal, says set this operation parameter to this value, XL none. And then skip blanks, that is another parameter, and it's set to false here. And transpose is another parameter, it's set to false. So what this does is paste what I had selected. It pastes the values, and I'm not sure what this operation XL none does. And skip blanks, I'm not sure exactly what that does, but and the transpose, I know what that does. It takes the rows and turns them into columns. So you don't need to know all this code 100%. You just need to be able to perform the action and use the macro recorder, and you can get the right code. So here I just wanted to paste special values, and this line of code that's highlighted does it. So if I step through it, there it's going to paste the values, and then I selected column AA. That's how you select a column. And then this application.cut copy mode false, it's basically like pressing your escape key. So you get out of that mode where you're cutting and copying things. And then I changed the format of this column to a date. So that's what this did. So I selected the column right there, and then I do the number format here. So I change the number format, then I select cell B1, and then I put a formula in cell B1. Here's the formula. And again, you don't need to understand exactly what's going on now because you're just beginning to code in VBA. But here's the code that does it. If you wanted to understand it, you can look up this stuff. And we'll do plenty of more examples. And there's plenty of examples on the website that you can look at. And I actually go through. There's hours and hours of video that you can look at. But now you just get an idea that this macro recorder is very useful because all the actions you want to do, you can see the code for. It's like your VBA expert programmer that you can go and get answers from. So here's how you put a formula in a cell. Here's one way. And this R2 in brackets and C colon R699C, that is just a format of row column format. So this is saying row sum from row 2 and the same column to row 699 and the same column. So if you look at this, this formula, it's summing from B3 to B700. Well, B3 is 2 rows below here, and B700 is 699 rows below. So that's what this is doing. It's saying whatever the address is 2 rows below in the same column, that's what you're going to see in the formula, and that's why you see B3 over here. And then whatever the address is 699 rows below and in the same column, you're going to see in the formula here. And then you select, I selected this range again, and I activated that range, and then I changed the font to bold here, selection.font bold. And then I selected all the cells in the worksheet, and then there's a syntax width and end width, and in between the width and the end width you can apply these properties to this object. So here's my selection object, and I'm applying all these properties. This is a property, horizontal alignment. This is a property, vertical alignment. And I'm setting these properties, all these properties like wrap text, I'm setting them to values. And again, I didn't write any of this code. It was all recorded by the macro recorder. But what I did is say I wanted to center it, and it sort of included other code. So one thing that you should note about with the macro recorder is that it might give you extra code. So all I really did in my actions was do this. I just did horizontal alignment center. But it also included other stuff. It gave us whatever the properties were at the time. It didn't change any of them. it just gave us these properties like vertical alignment. It was set to XL bottom, and for whatever reason it put it in here. So sometimes it gives you extra code, but that could be a good thing because you're learning how to do stuff that you might not learn elsewhere, like how to merge cells. Like if you want to merge cells, now you know how to merge cells. It's with this dot merge cells property. So it goes back to the question: how do you know what classes to use and what members of the classes to use? Well, you don't really need to know. You don't need to go in the object browser and sort of look for stuff. You can just use a macro recorder and it'll show you like here's the object, and here's a method or a property, a sub procedure or function. I don't know what this is, this merge cells. We can look it up and see if it's a property. It's most likely a property, and you can see that, oh, I want to merge cells. Well, here's how you do it. There's the object, and you use this with statement. This means it applies these properties to this object, and you set it to a value, true or false. And then, if I just keep going through this, all those properties are set on this selection object, which is the whole thing, the whole worksheet here. And then I selected cell B2, and then I changed the interior to yellow. But again, notice it included some other properties like pint, pattern, and tint shade, and some other stuff. But this is the line color 6535 that sets the selection dot interior. Notice the width is applied to the selection dot interior. So this is what I have selected. Excuse me. And when I have it selected, I use the width to do width selection dot interior, and whatever I have selected I can apply all these properties to, and there you go. Then that's all the code that was recorded, and it did exactly what we want to do. So if I just delete these columns, this is on sheet 5, and if I go over to goodbye, we can now run our macro, and let's see the different ways we can run the macro. Well, we know we can run the macro by putting our cursor in here and clicking the run button or pressing F5. But you can also run the macro by going to the macros icon here, and you can look for your macro. Oops. I ran a macro there that oops, I deleted the Alt F11. I should comment out these. Let me just scroll up, because I deleted, when I ran that macro, it deleted A4 to B6. So here I had date. Let me just go into this sheet and delete those events real quick. Go to this project, sheets, goodbye, this workbook. So I don't want these things to happen anymore. I'm just going to comment them out, these events, because they're annoying me. Now I could go back to goodbye, and because it deleted it, I'll just, ooh. Well, that's on sheet 1, I'm sorry. And if I gotta go to sheet 1 and clear this out too, or comment this out. So I'm sorry for doing that. But let me go to the goodbye sheet. Scroll up to A4. There it is. Okay. I was on the wrong sheet, sorry. But those events were annoying. That's one thing. That's a good thing to see though, because you should be aware that if you have event code, if you're running, code in events like we did earlier in the class, you want to be aware of that. So you don't want them to run all the time, most likely. And we'll get into if statements very soon, and we'll see how we can use conditional statements and things like that. But for now, I just want to show you how to run the macro we just recorded. And again, go to the macros icon right there, and then you can look for it. So here's that move range macro, and you can run the macros here too. You can click the run button. So if I click run, it just ran and it did all that. Now what took me like 15 or 20 seconds was just completed in less than a second. So that's the usefulness of macros in VBA, is that you could take manual work, you can use the macro recorder, and you can record a macro, and you could see the code and learn how to do all those things with the code, and then you can just run it instead of doing the manual work. So again, you could run it here by finding it. Here's all the macros in all the open workbooks. In this case, I only have one open workbook. These are all the macros that we wrote. You could also step into it. So if I do step into this move range macro, it'll step into it just like we normally step into it. And then you can edit it. If you click the edit button, it'll allow you to edit it. You can delete it. So this move range, if I edit it, it'll just take me to edit it. If I click delete, it'll delete it. And if I click options, you can change the shortcut key and you could change the description. So we didn't set a shortcut key, but you could, and you could just put, if you put E in there, you could just click OK and then click close, and now if I do Control E, it just ran the macro. So that's what a shortcut key does. It allows you to run macros with your keyboard instead of clicking the mouse or going to the run button or things like that. You just press Control E. If I do it again, Control E, it just ran the macro again. So this is maybe the top 3 videos in the class, other than the object, the class is an object video and the object browser video. This is one of those really important videos, because using this macro recorder and doing whatever it is you want to do, and then going into the code and looking at it, it tells you exactly what you want to know. It tells you what you need to know to become a VBA programmer. Like how all this stuff is working, it's pretty straightforward. You just have objects, and then the dot operator is accessing functions or subprocedures or properties, and then sometimes you have parameters that you have to set, like, okay, you want to paste something. Do you want to paste the values or not, or do you want to paste the formulas or whatnot? You'll get to know all this stuff. You don't, like I said, you don't need to memorize this, but you should just know. You could see what's going on. Here's all kinds of objects, and there's all kinds of properties and functions and subprocedures. And then you have some other keywords like this with thing, and you'll get used to all this stuff. It's nothing to freak out about. But the main idea is you can see the code, and it's intuitive because you're the person performing the operation, and it's writing the code behind the scenes, and then you could take a look at it. A couple limitations to the macro recorder are that you cannot record functions. You can only record subprocedures. So the macro recorder cannot record functions. The macro recorder cannot declare variables. So notice there's no variables declared here. It can't declare variables. The macro recorder cannot use if statements or and statements or conditional statements. So if you want to perform this macro that we just did, only if certain values in a cell or something, you would need to write a conditional statement like if something something something, and we'll get into that in the next video to see how we can use if statements. But the macro recorder can't do it. Another thing is that the macro recorder cannot do loops. So say if you want to do this macro 100 times for whatever reason, say it was a different macro and you wanted to do it 100 or 1,000 times, it can't do it. It doesn't allow you to put loops in it. So if statements and loops it can't do, variables it can't do, but we already know how to write variables, so you can do that. The if statements, and statements, and or statements, I'll show you how to do that coming up shortly, and loops, I'll show you how to do that coming up shortly. And then once you have those, once you have if statements, and OR statements, conditional statements, and loops, which you're going to learn in a bit. Once you have those things, then you're off on your own. I mean, then you should be able to get some really good-looking programs running, because you would use what the strategy would be is, if you don't know how to do something in VBA, use the macro recorder and get the code, and then add in variables, add in if statements, add in loops to make it even better. And that's how we're going to move forward with this, is that we know what this stuff is, objects and functions and they're members of the class, the functions and sub-procedures and things like that, and properties. We know that. We know variables. We know events. We know how to use the macro recorder now. So now we can, if we're ever stuck, we can use the macro recorder and then make really sophisticated programs using if statements and loops. And we'll get into that coming up. So that's it for this video.